Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos y muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en este Convergence Lab de Arizona State University. Mi nombre es Mia Armstrong y soy la coordinadora de Convergence Lab. Trabajo con Andrés Martínez en esta serie de eventos que normalmente organizamos en la Ciudad de México. Y bueno, antes que nada, les quiero pedir una disculpa porque normalmente todos nuestros eventos son completamente bilingües, pero en este caso no hemos encontrado la manera de incorporar la traducción en un foro virtual como este. Entonces, bueno, hoy obviamente vamos a estar hablando en inglés, pero espero que pronto podamos seguir con el ritmo de nuestros eventos presenciales y que les pueda dar un abrazo a todos ustedes. So for those of you who didn't catch that, I'm going to switch to English now. My name is Mia Armstrong, and I'm the coordinator of Convergence Lab at Arizona State University. Thank you so much for joining us in today's event. For those of you who aren't familiar with Convergence Lab, we are a project that brings together thinkers and researchers and students and creators across borders to really consider shared problems, learn from each other, and build a better common North American future. So Convergence Lab holds a series of events like this one, normally in person in Mexico City, but for obvious reasons we have moved our events temporarily online. And actually I think today that gives us a unique opportunity to bring together a lot of different people in different physical places in one single virtual space, which is both a pun and a sort of metaphor for our conversation today. As you know, we're going to be talking about space exploration, and space exploration is central to a lot of the work that we do at Arizona State University through projects like our ASU-led NASA Psyche mission, which is a space mission to the asteroid Psyche orbiting the sun between Mars and Jupiter that is targeted to launch in summer of 2020. And I think one of the cool things about the Psyche mission in particular as it relates to this discussion is that one of its goals is to engage the largest possible cross-section of individuals in the process of this mission through things like free online courses that really bring you into the team that is leading that mission. And so you can find more information and all those resources at psyche.asu.edu. I really encourage you to check it out. So today, the people who are going to lead us on our journey are Juan Villoro and Cady Coleman, which means that I have the enormous challenge of trying to introduce two people whose introductions could probably last this whole hour. I know they say that in front of most of these sorts of events, but in this case, I think it actually is true. So I will do my very best. But as many of you know, Juan Villoro is an award-winning journalist, novelist, and playwright. He's been a professor at Yale, Stanford, Princeton, and La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, among others. He thinks and writes about a wide variety of topics, including music, sport, history, travel, identity, politics, culture, and cultural exploitation, and many more. And he's published several books that have been widely reclaimed, including El Testigo, Los Culpables, or in English, The Guilty, Dios es Redondo, or God is Round, and Arrecife, or The Reef. So if you haven't read his work yet, I would really recommend diving in if you're looking for a place to dive in. A good short story that he recently published with our ASU Future Tense fiction project is Paciente Cero. It was published in English in Slate Magazine and in Spanish in Letras Libres. And it's just a really beautiful blend of science fiction and futurism and imagination and authoritarianism and globalism and many other different themes. So definitely check that out. On the other side of the virtual table from Juan is Cady Coleman, who is ASU's Global Explorer in Residence at the School of Space Exploration and the Interplanetary Initiative. And I will say that Global Explorer in Residence is only Cady's second or third coolest title because she is also a former NASA astronaut and a retired US Air Force colonel who has spent more than 180 days in space, accumulated during 2 space shuttle missions and a 6-month expedition to the International Space Station, where she acted as the lead robotics and lead science officer. Among many other roles, Cady is a chemist. She's a passionate advocate for inclusion in STEM and STEAM, and she's also a musician. In 2011, she was actually the space half of the first ever Earth space duet. She played the flute aboard the International Space Station, while musician Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull played on Earth down below to celebrate 50 years of human space flight. So if you haven't seen that video, it is really remarkable. So I also recommend that you Google it. In terms of the order of the day, Cady is going to start by giving us a brief presentation, and then Cady and Juan are going to engage in a conversation. As they have questions as you have questions during that conversation, excuse me, please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then we will dedicate the last 15 minutes or so of the presentation to answering as many of those questions as possible. So without further ado, Cady, I will let you take it away.
Okay, unmuting, always the first step. I'm really happy to be with everybody today. I live in Western Massachusetts, so not Boston, but about 2 hours west of there. Out in the country in farmland. My husband is a glass artist and his studio is out there. And so in these difficult times where we actually live in a fairly idyllic place where there's really not very much disease, but certainly this, the need for the same cautions that you need in the places that are busier. But it is a little more isolated, so I'm actually really happy to have a little company. And I actually traditionally work out virtually with my trainer at exactly this time, so you have gotten me out of gym. This is good. Anyways, let me just start out, and I'll just share my sort of messy screen here. I just wanted to start and just, for about, I don't know, we agreed on something between 5 and 10 minutes, and I'll try really hard not to be any longer than that. I'd just like to share a little bit about sort of what space is about. And I think that hopefully throughout this whole hour, what comes through is that I feel very privileged to have been somebody that got to be part of space exploration. And actually it really kind of never ends. You're just always part of that family. And I think it's about having a certain passion. And yet we don't get to have many people go yet, I think more and more. And I think maybe we're going to talk about that. But I do feel very privileged to have been. So I love to share having been able to go. And so this is a picture of my very first launch on the space shuttle. I had 2 shuttle missions and then an almost 6-month expedition to the International Space Station. And I thought we'd spend most of the time on the space station, but I thought I'd just give you an introduction to, my missions, a little bit about what we do up on the space station, and how we do it as an international space station, which has about 16 major partners. The sort of pillar ones are probably the Russians and the US, Canada, Japan, and a mixture of countries in Europe. But there's I think over 100 countries involved, certainly Mexico, in doing experiments up on the space station there. It's actually being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize this year. I just finished helping to narrate some of the video for that. It's an amazing thing that we do, and I think the way we do it is actually helpful to look at for trying to do hard things down here, which I think these days we all have a lot of very hard things on our plate. And even social distance is, a difficult thing to do. And I think focusing on the mission that we have to keep each other safe is something that can help us get through these difficult times. But back to space, I was on my way at this point. In this picture, the shuttle's going 100 miles an hour, and I am actually sitting under one of those tiny, tiny little windows. And let's see, sometimes this doesn't like to go. I think, there we go. Let's see, we'll see what's happening here. I think it'll work. So this just shows you how fast we're going. And inside there, this is my first mission, and there were 7 of us. 5 were rookies. And so for 5 of us, it was our first time to go. And we actually had 7 launch attempts over 30 days. And as a human being, I think it just begins to emphasize to you that you really might not get to do this after all. And so when we finally took off from the launch pad, I think we were all just completely so excited. In fact, I seem to remember that the commander who had flown before said something like, "Settle down," because we were so excited. This is my second mission, and a very special one. First of all, because we launched basically the sister of the Hubble Space Telescope, which is called the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and it's right in the payload bay in the back of the space shuttle here. Just it's the biggest and the heaviest thing we ever brought to space at that time. And it's the telescope that tells us everything we know about black holes and about dark matter also, understanding what we need to go look at for dark matter. So it's a really important telescope. And right here is our crew. And so we had Michel Tony from France, and Jeff Ashby from the US, who now is in charge of safety and mission assurance for Blue Origin. And then this is in the middle is Eileen Collins. She's the first woman to command the space shuttle. And here is Steve Hawley. All of us are something else before we go to space and become astronauts, or become astronauts and go to space. And Steve is an astronomer. And then myself, who is a chemist and came from a military background, but really mostly a scientist in the military there. So this is now the space station. And on the left-hand side, you see this right here. If you look carefully, you'll see that that is the space shuttle, and there's the tail hanging down. And this is the space station with the shuttle attached. And this picture is quite unique. You'll see it in a lot of different places, but only 3 people have ever seen it with their own eyes. And I happen to be one of them. And that's because we brought a lot of people and things up to the space station in the space shuttle and in the Russian Soyuz, but we never actually had the shuttle and the station together when we would undock or come into dock with the Soyuz. And I was up there until the last space shuttle came right after I left. And suddenly people realized that they needed a picture of what we'd all done together as people. And so this picture ends up just reminding people that what we do is hard, and at the same time, it's real efforts by real people that make it happen. And so the space station, I went up there with Paola Nespoli on the right from Russia, or sorry, from Italy, and in the middle, Dmitry Kondratev from Russia. And I tell people this is a picture of all of us really excited about going to space. Now, if we were in the same room, and I do see Juan smiling, but I think you're smiling because there's someone in this picture that doesn't look as excited. And that was really my first lesson in international relations, is that this is a picture of all of us excited about going to space. And I needed to learn that Dmitry, as a traditional Russian person, was probably not going to smile in a picture. And he often had a sort of serious face. And then I needed to realize that there's a real person very excited about space, and in fact, about what I'm saying, what I'm suggesting, my ideas. And I sort of needed to reprogram my reaction to his outward appearance. So it was my sort of first cultural lesson. This shows you that this Russian capsule is actually quite small, and I think it's what you might associate with, oh, going to space. I don't know if that's me. So small, so cramped. Would I want to do that? But it's not like that on the space station. And so this is a map. It's an American football field, but it's shows you the space station laid out there. It's really pretty big. Now we actually live along the 50-yard line here, along the middle. And we have about 10 different modules in there, some of them going up, some of them going down. They're each the size of like a giant school bus or a train car, but with no seats in them. So there's really a lot of room for 6 people. And this is our crew of 6. When we get there as a crew of 3 people are already there. So now we are 6. A little while later, 3 land, 3 more come. So it's kind of an integrated cycle. And so this is about a 1.5-minute movie. And it just shows a little bit about what it's like to get ready. This is actually launch day. We're climbing up the stairs. We're inside here, almost like inside a tin can is our capsule. Our capsule, the place that we actually sit, is about the size of a smart car. It's attached to one more little smart car sized thing in case we need to take a lot of time up in orbit. And then it takes about, I tell people it takes about 8.5 minutes to get to space, and about 1.5 days to parallel park. We can do it faster. We can do it in about 6 hours now that we're pretty good at it. But when I was going, it was a day and a half, a magical day and a half, I will tell you. And then this is life up in space, you know, being a person. I'm not the most amazing musician. I was never like the first chair or someone who they said, oh, you should major in music. In fact, I think everyone was sort of relieved when I said I was going to major in chemistry. And this is the view out the window. It's not like this aurora borealis every day, but it's really wonderful. And I think you see, you know, you see the curve of the earth there, you see the stars in the back. You know, we're not very far away. All these lights are the lights of cities. The little splashy lights are lightning. And this is kind of sped up video. We don't actually go this fast. And I always think it's nice to have a little bit of home at the end of at least my films. And this is where my ancestors came from, was from Ireland. And there's our space station. And what about 2 minutes, Juan, just to run through a tiny bit of science? Will that work?
Perfect.
And so, you know, there's things that we do that you think, oh, they do spacewalks up there. This is me very proud to be actually the smallest person to have their spacesuit on the space station. And then we also do a lot of robotics. So these are these like space-like things, but we do a lot of keeping track of stuff and actually using the fact that everything floats around. So this is a funny thing of Scott with oranges and tomatoes. Let's see, do I have that working right, you guys? Yeah, I think I do. So you can see that when everything is floating around, it's actually kind of fun, but we get to see things like, look at this water drop. Now, without the force of gravity, which is overwhelming, we get to see what are some of the tiny forces on liquids. And so we get to understand, what do liquids really want to do? And that's really important here on Earth. For example, everything that involves flow through a pipe or flow, whether it's a river or the flow in your pipes or any factory where things are made, it's the tiny forces that really control how things work out. And so when we go to space, the tiny forces become the whole game, and we get to study them much easier. It's the same with growing plants. We do that up there. So we'd like to understand how to grow food for the way to Mars. But what we're really doing is understanding, how can we grow food when our resources are few, when we don't have a lot of water or the kind of soil that we can grow food. And all these things that I just talked about, they're lessons for exploring further, for living on the moon, living on Mars, but they're also lessons for living right here on Earth. And I think that it's nice that space has that kind of partnership. So growing plants, I'm a particularly bad plant growing person, and so here on Earth. And so actually up in space, my job was to kill one of these plants every day. And I was actually quite good at that. I was specially elected on the crew. And that's my last slide there. And I think this slide really is the epitome of what I'm hoping we get to talk about today, which is, you know, what is the relationship between humans and the planet that they come from? And what I discovered when I got to go to space was I used to think that we're here on Earth and then space is somewhere else, and some people go like it's somewhere else. But actually, Earth, and the place that we call home, is just bigger than we thought. And just not enough people have been to these edges yet. And we'll see where the edges really are, hopefully with yourselves in the audience and our children and our children's children. And with that, I will stop the screen sharing and go to Juan and answer questions. I've been really looking forward to talking to you, Juan.
Hi, Cady. Thank you so much for sharing these wonderful images. As you might know, in Mexico, we have had a lot of wonderful astronomers from the Maya to the present, but yes, we don't have a space program. We don't have any kind of rocket industry aside from the fireworks that we use in our popular fiestas. But we are deeply interested in space. I was 12 years old when the Apollo 11 reached the moon. And for my generation, that changed the whole idea of the universe. One of the members of this generation, Alfonso Cuarón, who is an accomplished filmmaker, he won an Oscar for directing gravity. And many people thought, well, how come a Mexican is so deeply interested in outer space and is so accurate in his redemption of what's going on out there? So, well, it's because this adventure has been important for the whole human race. But I remember as well that in the 60s, this was part of the Cold War, and there was a kind of concurrence between cosmonauts from the Soviet Union and American astronauts. The American writer Tom Wolfe said that there was a kind of a single combat, the cosmonaut against the astronaut, two different countries fighting in outer space. But things have changed for the better, and the subject of this talk is exploring an inclusive space. You have been part of the international space expedition. You have worked with Russians, Italians, and people from other countries. How do you see yourself as an astronaut? Do you represent one country? Do you represent the whole human race? You were talking about this thing. The home is the Earth itself. How do you see this inclusive space?
Well, it's nice that you ask that, because I have to say my view changed when I got to space. And, you know, if you even look at my jacket, you know, we have our patches and oops, it's backwards in the video. Anyways, but, you know, I have my US patch on my sleeve. And when we're picking out shirts, often there'll be like a little patch of your country on your sleeve. And it's hard to say this without sounding like you don't appreciate, you know, your home, or with the fact that we all come from somewhere. But looking back at the Earth, it's just, we're all from the same place. And it seemed almost like a non sequitur, like, oh, I have this on my sleeve. Like, what does it matter? We're all from there. And so I liked that feeling of knowing that. And I wanted to actually just go back to two things that you said you didn't ask, but I'd love to just mention, is that I actually got to meet Mr. Coron, the director, because when I was up on the space station, my little brother met Sandra Bullock's brother-in-law. And I ended up, he said, do you think your sister would give Sandra some advice about being an astronaut? And of course she didn't, you know, need very much help, but we got to talk to her, our crew did. It was great, a source of great morale. And when I saw the movie, it really meant so much to me, because, you know, I can't bring everybody with me, and I wish they knew, you know, what the view was like. And I think that what he did in that movie was he showed people the view, but he also showed people what it felt like to have that view. And I was so thankful for that. And I think when we first met, I think he was expecting maybe that I would discuss, you know, maybe this conflict in physics or something like that. But I think he realized that I just loved his movie.
And did you felt this kind of anxiety of getting lost in space?
No, I will say. I mean, well, partly because, you know, we decide whether we want to be there. I mean, it is a dangerous place. But, you know, if anything, I think astronauts are often a little frustrated with how cautious we have to be, because really the whole goal is to explore but come home. And so, you know, there's always like, what if this happens? What if this happens? We've thought about those things with the teams on the ground, and we make sure we know how to do them. Even, for example, having your leash to the space station come undone, you know, we have ways of flying ourselves back, and we don't get certified for the mission until we show we can do that under some pressure.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Cady, what are the challenges of being a woman in this profession? Do you foresee a gender equality in the future in the space race?
Well, it's a little frustrating to be on board and to be the only person who knows how to multitask. So I'm making a joke, but really, you know, we're all different up there, and I think you know, I had sort of an obvious difference. I looked different, and I thought different in my case. But when you're up there and it's just the six of you, you realize that those differences are precious, and that and if you don't, then I mean, you know, you just have to. And I think it's a luxury for us that the mission is clearly so important, and more important than whether we wish each other was different or we wish each other was the same. And we are really forced to, I mean, it's just it's so clear that every minute you spend doing some experiments or actually expressing something in a human point of view that you managed to bring home, every one of those things is important, and you need your crewmates' help to do that. And so I think we appreciate each other, but I do look forward to times that it's not so obvious. You know, can I show you a quick slide?
Perfect, yes, please.
And actually I was wanting to show this just because, let's see, let me do this. Let's see, why does this do that? There we go. And I wanted to show you this picture, and also this another picture after it. This is a picture of my crew. There's Paolo, not Dimitri, but Paolo and I, and Scott Kelly I flew with. Here you can see that's Scott Kelly, who's a pretty well-known astronaut because he spent a year in space. And then Paolo, so it's some of the 6 of us there. It's also Scott's twin brother, Mark. We're both in that, they're both in that picture. But I stick out in this picture because I'm wearing the wrong color shirt. And we had a little communication problem with wardrobe. But it turns out that, you know, it worked out. But even though everybody else looks the same in this picture, I think everyone in a picture like this feels like there are things about themselves that other people don't see. And it reminds me of this picture, which comes from a movie called Hidden Figures. And in this picture, the middle of the picture is Katherine Johnson. Actually, her maiden name is Cady Coleman Johnson. So I think in some ways we are sisters. She's a mathematician that designed the trajectories to get people from the Earth to space and back for the Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury programs. And there's a famous John Glenn story where he says, I'm not getting in that capsule until that woman, the smart one, does the calculations for those newfangled computers. But you know, here she is, she's a woman of color. In almost every picture, she's in a dress of color. She's in a sea of white guys in skinny black ties. There is nothing hidden about her, and yet we didn't see her. And I think that this is really the key to all hard endeavors that we have, or you know, whatever you're working on that you think is important, whether it's in your community or more global or involves space, is that we have to continue looking for what we don't understand about people. You know, let them surprise you. And I think it takes work on the part of all of us to sort of volunteer to say, this is what I bring to the table, even when we think they might not see it. And it's also our responsibility to look for the people who don't know how to be brave like that and say, hey, so what are you bringing? What do you want to say that you're not saying? So, end of my lecture.
Thank you so much. I read Scott Kelly's book. It's called Endurance, about his year in space. And I was really surprised to see how complicated it was for him to recover some tiny aspects of daily life. For example, walking. It was really difficult because after so much time without gravity, he wasn't used to walk. So can you tell us something about the surprise of going back to planet Earth?
Well, I have to say I would have spent another 6 months in space in a minute if I could. I really loved it there, and I loved making the work happen. You know, the experiments, and by that time I felt like my family understood. You know, they're very well taken care of when you're up in space. People pay a lot of attention to make sure they're safe and good. So I would have stayed. So I was a little bit disappointed to come home, and but not. I mean, but then once you're coming, it's just nice to be here, and it's nice to rediscover. I mean, it's nice to be part of the view and not just looking at the view. And in the beginning, there is a lot of adjustment of your head, mostly because you're really used to flying from place to place so gracefully with it. I mean, it really takes very little force to move. I think there's a little video on the web called Splitting Hairs in Gravity, where if I took one hair from my head and I pushed it against the computer here, like this, I would push myself across the whole space station. That's how little force it takes to move. So your head is used to very small, tiny cues, and now suddenly you're walking, and it's it's a little bit when you get out, like when you get off of a ship, and you have that feeling, and you're just doing that, but it's more like, whoa, whoa. But to me, it just reminded me that I just came back from a very special place.
Mm-hmm. Can you say that there is a kind of addiction or fascination of being out there? I remember the story of Sergei Krikalev. You know, he was in outer space in 1991, 1992 for 311 days. And then the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And somebody said, how is he going to come back to the Earth, because the Soviet space program doesn't exist anymore. To a certain extent, he was the first person to be in exile from the Earth for a while, and this seemed to be a great tragedy. And I was as a witness of all this, and I was surprised and moved, and finally he came back to planet Earth. And of course, I lost track of Sergei Krikalev, and some years later, in 2005, I discovered that he was back in outer space, and he has broken a record, and he spent like almost 800 days, 800 days in space. So this man who was there so long by accident the first time, then he was there by free will. It was like a kind of addiction to be there. I guess you can understand that feeling.
You know, I can, and it seems, you know, ungrateful in a way, because, you know, you're lucky to go even once. And actually in the beginning, you know, you're applying to be an astronaut, and you just want them to read your application and say they did. And then you want them to check your references, and then you want an interview, and then you want to be picked, you know, it never stops. And yet, it's very, very special. And Sergei himself is actually a particularly special person. I think he was an Olympic volleyball player. He's somebody, there are some people who just have a very wise head. He was actually part of the very first expedition to the International Space Station. Himself and Bill Shepard were the very first people up on the space station. And I got a lot of advice, because there is, you know, integrating between cultures and understanding, you know, what's different and what's not, and how to blend with your crewmates and how to have them see you. And Sergei himself personally helped me with some of those things, which was very kind of him.
Hey, Cady, what's your take on private flights to outer space, these Elon Musk projects?
Well, I would go with whatever vehicle is leaving. I mean, it's just the taxi to get there, you know, and I don't care what it is. But I really love these additional collaborations, because, you know, exploring space is hard, and yet there are some things that we have figured out. We, meaning, you know, the Russians, I mean, around the world, groups of people have figured out how to get people and stuff up to a space station, right? And it's about 250 miles up there, you know, a couple hundred kilometers. It's not so far, but we know how to get people and stuff up there safely. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but once governments and big organizations like that know how to do that, then it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to give those projects to a company like SpaceX, like Boeing, who's also designing a commercial crew capsule, like Blue Origin, like Virgin Galactic. I mean, all of these people are bringing us to space in different ways. And certainly the commercial companies can approach risk in a different way than the government. We know what, I mean, for the government, for the US government, I can only speak for us, but, and I'm retired, so I don't really speak for the government, right? But, you know, if we have some incident where, you know, there's some big loss of hardware and certainly some loss of life in terms of space exploration, everything will stop, and we will look, and we will have to understand everything. Now, if it's loss of life, that's going to happen to the contractors as well. But for hardware, if it's just a piece of a rocket that didn't work right, they can actually go, okay, let's do this experiment. Let's build this thing and let's see. They can't put people on it. And I mean, those rules are very clear, but they can take bigger risks with hardware than the government can. And that way they leap ahead and they bring everybody with them, if that makes sense. So, and they bring great ideas, and they help, I think, you know, at least, you know, NASA to be a little more nimble as well with some of the chances that they take. So I think everyone was pretty excited about this launch going back to space. And it does add more flexibility to be able to launch from your own country, which is why I think it's nice, you know, I think, you know, Mexico will have more and more space goals as well. And, you know, you just need to make sure, I don't know, you just need to have partners to launch with. And closer,
Aren't you afraid that this is going to be like an extreme sports for billionaires going out in outer space, paying a huge amount of money? The investment, of course, is very useful, but also this kind of commercial outer space travel can be complicated, I guess, in some respect.
Well, I don't see it that way, and I tend to be kind of a glass half full person, but for example, so I don't really see it as a billionaire sport kind of thing. I see them as people with means and vision that want to use that means and vision to make a difference in the world. Mm-hmm. And for example, up until just recently, the only way to go to space was with the US as an astronaut, but the Russians actually would sell rides to space. And there's been about a dozen people that did that. And I've known more than half of them, and every single one of them uses the fact that they have the means to buy that seat, to go up to space and do something that makes a difference that actually the government agencies can't do. Guy de la Liberté from Canada, who founded the Cirque du Soleil, made a big show, a big charity show about water and about the resources on the earth. Charles Simeone has done a lot of educational kinds of things, making space and education accessible to people. I mean, almost everyone I know that's done that, I know I'm sort of lecturing here, but comes back and makes a difference. It's not just so they can say that they went. I mean, maybe there is some of that, right? And I even see that with Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, where it's about, I think, $275,000 to go. And I think that he has a mission. And the mission is that, I mean, it does take some means to buy that ticket for him, even though it's not the millions with the Russians to go for longer. But when people of means and resources get to come up and look and see our Earth from above, they will forever be changed. And he has a plan for when they get home, and they now have the vision, hey, this is where we could use some help. So I think it's very exciting to have more people involved.
Talking about the content of these flights, can you tell us something about the experiments you were doing there and about this unsolved mystery of dark matter?
So I'll start with just the physics kinds of things. I showed like the ball of water. I showed, I didn't get to show a candle flame, you know, the way it burns differently in space. Like here on the ground, it's kind of like a hot air balloon. The lighter gases are going to rise. But in space, since everything's weightless, nothing is rising. So our flames are spherical. They're much easier to measure. And so measurements that we have to make down here on the Earth in like less than a second to determine the slope of a line, we can make up in space over 30 or 40 seconds. And so suddenly we have so many data points, and we're able to understand more about how does combustion work? How can we make it more efficient? How can we not be burning, not be using so much fuel and creating soot and pollution? So we're learning things in space that really we can't learn down here, and I think that's really important. And one of those things is we literally brought a telescope up and strapped it onto the space station, actually just as I was leaving. In fact, that telescope was being done in spacewalks as we were exiting from our mission. And it's looking out into the universe and discovering more and more about dark matter, which makes up, I don't ever have my percentages right, but it's some large percentage of the universe that we haven't even seen. So I think that these experiments are really important, even the experiments on ourselves. Up in space, we lose bone faster, 10 times faster than a woman who is 70 years old who has osteoporosis. So what she loses in an entire year in terms of bone, I will lose in a month in space. So it's really happening quite quickly. And that's the bad news. But the good news is because of that, I can do blood samples and urine samples and different tests. And in fact, in my case, testing an osteoporosis drug, because the changes happen fast for us, we get to be very good data. And so and now I get a physical every year, which is kind of fun. Not always fun, actually. But anyway, so I think there's a lot of really important experiments being done in space. That doesn't mean I think they're more important than the ones that happen on Earth, but it is a unique environment that allows us to do some unique things.
And what were the things that you were missing the most when you were in space? You were dreaming about something, recovering something, the things you missed the most?
I have to say that I really loved being up there, and I was maybe wistful for some things, but I really didn't want to come home really quite yet. I missed my family. We had, sort of a different way of being together. I would read stories to my son at night.
Bedtime stories from outer space.
Well, and actually, there were stories. I think it's real. I think I know you're a writer, and we talked about the Gravity movie, and art. People who do things through art, who share the stories. I mean, how in the world can you have a big project if you can't share the vision? And just explaining the vision in equations is not going to do for everybody. And can I maybe show my husband's art
Absolutely.
stuff? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
And also this is for me kind of the way that we let's see. Oops, did something bad happen here? No, we're here. Okay. Sorry. Let me just try this again. I was doing so well, Juan. Sorry. I think I forgot to push the button there. There we go. And I am going to so this is our family, and this is kind of about family. I mean, this is the thing that brought us together as a crew. We could be all from different places, but we missed our families back on the Earth. That's my son standing in Russia right after I launched. I left him with his trusty cat and a dad, but it's important and our cat is a Maine Coon, so he thinks he's a dog. It's a very confused cat, this cat. But he's grown up to be a nice guy. I have a wacky husband who's an artist guy, and he's a glass artist. And I say this because it's not just a glass art. I mean, it's storytelling of all sorts. It's music. He happens to make planets that he made a dozen years before we ever met. But I liked them very much, and they were expensive, so eventually I had to get married in order to have enough of them, right? But when we think about exploring, and who knows what these places will look like. And at the same time, I think it's a crew. It's that feeling about family that really takes us from sort of a picture like this to to this kind of group, and it's this kind of camaraderie that I think is really important for all of us to accomplish things.
And Cady, thank you so much for sharing so many thoughts and pictures and experiences. I guess there is time to take some questions from the people who are hearing us. Mia, I'm going back to you. Do you have some questions?
Yes, so I think we're going to start with a question from Manuel Alejandro Gutierrez from Oaxaca. I think it's a question that maybe a lot of people will be sharing right now. So he says, I'm from Mexico. I'm currently studying mechatronic engineering in 7th semester. My biggest dream is to work at NASA. Any recommendations?
I recommend that you think not just of NASA. I mean, that used to be the only place to work, right? If you wanted to be working in space exploration. But now there's really more places that are doing really exciting work as well. And so I urge you to, it's just that I think what's happening at NASA is really wonderful as well, right? And at the same time now, you really have a wider field. And I would look at, what they're doing at Blue Origin, what they're doing at Virgin Galactic, at Boeing, and a bunch of companies I haven't even named. And some of them are small, which is pretty exciting for a new engineer to be able to work at. And I also know that it's a little hard right now with COVID and the circumstances, and realize that, you know, when we're going to the moon and Mars and when we live on a space station, I mean, we can't be together, you know, in person either. And so we're, you know, realize that no matter where you are, you have things to offer and you have ways to get insight, and you might have to remind people, especially if you're virtual and others aren't. I find this, we have to remind each other of what we don't have so that people can send us all the right, you know, information, or that we don't understand the context of what's going on. So, you know, ask for what you need, because as an emerging engineer, you're really important for our world.
Great. So we have another question. This one is anonymous. I'm going to read it in Spanish and then in English. ¿Qué acciones hay para que la participación de la mujer en el espacio aumente a tal punto que sea equivalente a la del hombre? Or in English, what initiatives exist so that women's participation in space increases to be equivalent to that of men?
Well, not enough initiatives, I will say. At the same time, in the last few astronaut classes, they have been literally 50-50, 50% women, 50% men. I mean, some of those classes are small, you know, 8 people, 4 women, 4 men, but it's a start. And I was particularly happy. I mean, I think that storytelling and passing those stories to other people is part of what can be really important, because I think that when people, it doesn't have to be women, but when people see themselves in a story, in problem solving, then they think, oh, maybe this could be me. And so making sure that, you know, if your dream is to write a book or to make a commercial or a cartoon or, you know, any kind of thing like that, you know, please, 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 you know, include other people that really don't look or feel like you, because they're part of the equation. And by them seeing themselves in your story, it makes all the difference.
Great. So we have another anonymous question. This is a fun one. I saw lots of bare feet in Cady's presentation. Do astronauts hang out barefoot on the ISS?
On our crew, it was pretty much only me. And I sort of like being barefoot up here. I didn't do it all the time, because you do have you actually sort of start and stop with your feet. And in fact, we end up, when we come home, we have calluses on the top of our feet and the bottoms are very soft, like baby feet. And so because we're hanging on literally with our feet, you know, under the handrails, maybe like we'd sort of slide in and then your foot is sort of holding. And you do have, I mean, it's sort of a greater chance of stubbing your toe, just like down here on the Earth, you can stub your toe up there and it still hurts just as much. But I just sort of liked being barefoot sometimes. It just was sort of like, it's like walking through the grass down here. You just feel a little bit more a part of the place.
Great. This question comes from Ambrose Sanchez. She says, hello, I'm a psychology student in Mexico. Did you learn anything while in space that can be useful in these isolation times on Earth?
I think I did, and not just in space, but you know, my biggest answer for you, is it Amber, is that probably you already know a lot of these lessons, and people think, oh, you space people, you must know these, you were on the space station. But actually I learned a lot of them, you know, being away on long business trips, training for the space station, of how to be, you know, together with my family, make sure that everything was, well, everything's not going to happen the way you want it to. And that's actually the biggest lesson, right? Is letting go a little bit. But I think that the biggest thing is, I think that you really can, for me, it's valuable to focus on the mission. And if I think about today, where, first of all, we could talk about COVID, and, you know, I mean, there's a lot of differences for all of us, and it can be really overwhelming. And so I find that if I just say, okay, what is today's mission? Today's mission is to keep myself and my family safe. And how can I do that? Do I have to remind anybody of anything? Do I need to help my kid, who's now 19? Do I need to help him see some ways that he could be less frustrated, or he could be learning things, or, you know, how to see some opportunities. So I think just focusing on the mission really helps me not feel too overwhelmed. And even, in terms of the news that we're hearing lately, where, here in the States, and I think all over the world, there's a huge emphasis on, the fact that Black people in this country have been disadvantaged for a very, very long time. And all of us play a part in that, and that I have some things to learn. I've been, I try to now make part of my day to be learning something that I didn't know about what someone else's life has been like, and how can I be the person that helps make a difference in that, and maybe just by making a conversation easier for them. So I think focusing on the mission is the thing that I learned up in space.
The next question, I think that this can be for both of you. It comes from Claudia Sanchez, and she says, do you believe that they will develop special protocols to take into consideration human rights in space? Will there be a special figure that will serve as an ombudsman in space?
Oh, I would love to hear Juan's answer to this too. I think that's a very hard question. Do you know that we haven't had a space treaty since 1953? So all this is like new. What's fair? What's right? What do we need to do to make sure things stay fair and right? An example is, space is getting crowded. And so if two things are going to run into each other, who's supposed to move? And actually, some of these things, I'm very proud to be part of the Association of Space Explorers, and this is astronauts from all over the world, where we come together, we're together as an organization. We try to meet once a year, but we take on some things that we think are a point of view that only we will have, having been in space. And one of those is the problem of asteroids, of needing to understand that, we will have asteroids that hit this Earth. When the things that happen in Chelyabinsk will happen again. And it's not going to happen probably to one country, and that we need to, as a planet, figure out what our defense can be, and really just how to catalog the things that we see out in the solar system. We have the ability to do that if we work together. But the topic that we brought up this year was, it's crowded in space, and we need to have some agreements. And so we bring these things to the UN to try to start having some order and some discussions.
And I'm curious if you have...
Yes, well, I think it's a totally new turf. It's like virtual reality. We don't have a laws for that, but I think the only solution for the things that are that are happening in outer space and that are a challenge to us and that have an impact in us are going to be solved by the whole community of the Earth. I mean, I think it's very appropriate what Cady is saying. This is a subject for the United Nations. I mean, we need a new kind of rights or law for outer space, but we do need, of course, also new kinds of rights and regulations for what is happening in the Earth, and virtual reality is part of this as well. So this is a fascinating field, but we are just beginning to explore it.
Well, and something I'm gonna, if I can interrupt for a second, Mia, something I'm very excited about is, you mentioned it at the beginning about like the space race of who's going to get to space first, and really, I think at the time, I mean, sometimes it's the governments that are thinking about this, and the people really have the passion for exploration. And what was fascinating is when, now we have crews that are on the space station, Russians and Americans, where they realize that they've actually each been in military planes at exactly the same moment, looking at each other across their Russian-American border. And yet here they are, cosmonauts and astronauts on the same crew. And what I found in building, building these bridges, especially between, say, Russia or any of our partners, is the governments, have certain positions, but it's always the people between each other that build those bridges. And that's what I meant with those family slides, really, is that, we're all people, and that's one of the ways that we, establish such strong relationships between the countries that make up the International Space Station, is by you know, not so much the governments, but the people themselves just saying, this is what I think. What do you think? What can we do together? What are we allowed to do? Let's do that.
Great. And I think the last question, as we wrap up here, I'm actually going to merge two questions. So one comes from Sebastian Martinez and the other comes from Dina Agundez. And the questions are, would either of you accept a one-way ticket to Mars? That's the first question. And the second question is, if you were offered an opportunity to go to space right now for an important mission, would you accept it?
So I'm just going to say yes and yes. Now, I mean, a couple of years ago, I'm not sure I would have said yes to the one-way ticket. But, you know, maybe it's just that our son is older now and he's about to turn 20. And I feel like one of my missions was to bring up a person, and now he's a person. And I don't know, I would go, but I want to know what Juan says.
Yeah, well, I think, Cady, you're much braver than me. And well, you're a hero of sorts. So heroes exist to do things in reality. And we writers, we exist to do things just in our minds. I will write about going to Mars, and I will write about somebody who has a single ticket to Mars, but I will never go there.
Never say never.
Well, you never know. Exactly.
You never know. Probably I won't either, but I like to think about the possibilities. And maybe, you know, and actually being responsible for the fact that somebody got that, you know, felt like, oh, maybe I could do this because they read your book. I mean, it's the next best thing to going. Well,
that will be great. You know, Ray Bradbury, he wouldn't go on a plane. He didn't know how to drive, but he was very, very important for many people to do other things.
I agree.
I think maybe this is the beginning of a good collaboration, because we'll give Cady the one-way ticket and we'll let Juan write about the story.
Great.
We'll be talking. I like it.
Great. Well, is there anything you, Cady, or you, Juan, want to add before we close it out here?
No, thank you so much, and greetings from Mexico.
Well, and greetings from here. This was really nice to talk together, and I appreciate the great questions.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Cady.
Thanks.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you to everyone who has attended this Convergence Lab event. We hold events regularly, so to find out more about our events, you can follow us on Twitter. Our username is ASU_MX. So we look forward to getting to see you all again in person, hopefully soon, but in the meantime, through Zoom. So,
Mia, I just have to say that it's, you know, ASU is unique in this way. Like when I see events by ASU, I mean, I'm now a part of ASU, but there's a reason for that. And, you know, some of the things we're reading about lately, I mean, ASU is a place that really believes that education is for everyone. And so whenever I see an ASU event, I always know I'm going to learn something. So thank you.
No, thank you. And that's what we try and do through our Convergence Lab events is to really kind of build a bridge so that folks in Mexico and folks in the US can consider some of these really interesting issues, because, you know, as you both mentioned, they're issues that we can tackle and explore together. So thank you all so much for joining us. Stay safe, and we'll see each other here again soon.
Thanks very much. See you guys. Thank you.
Bye.